Hello, hello, hi. Welcome again to your next lecture in this Presidency and Politics course. As you know, my name is Daniel Kirsch. And today we're going to be moving into the very exciting phase of the class where you are going to be moving really from reader to writer, from simple observer to active researcher, okay? And so the way that we're going to do that is by building upon what you already have. But before we get into all of that, I'm going to explain some of the basics of what's going on in this module. So first of all, we're going to be talking about some very fundamental questions about research, some very fundamental things about the research surrounding the presidency in political science, and also a lot of the authors that kind of form the cornerstone of that research. Then we're going to be talking about, how you will eventually fit into that canon. And then I also want to talk about the resources you're going to be employing to do, the research that you'd like to do. And then how kind of proposals work and what are the different kinds of proposals and kind of what I'm after in this kind of assignment. And then the general idea of research design. And then in another lecture, I'm going to be talking about the ideas behind the different types of research design and the schools of thought that go into different kinds of social science and political science, kind of what makes presidency research even social science, kind of beyond journalism, beyond history, and what makes it its own sort of study in a way that's specific to political science. And in another video, that's going to look a little bit different. I'm going to be doing kind of helping you expand your own research proposal by doing sort of a dry run using myself as the kind of archetypal student. And by doing that, that'll be more of a Zoom recording where I'm going to share my screen and show you the ropes of where the databases are at the university and where to find all of your information. So, to begin with, what is research, right? Research is just the idea behind what we as people want to know and trying to find the answers to questions that we have that are not immediately obvious, that takes investigation to find out. And whether that's of an ordinary everyday nature or if it's of an academic nature, the approach is largely the same. You start with a question of why does something work the way that it does? How does something work the way that it does? When did something happen? How did something happen? And you going into a direction that will enable you to find those answers. And some political scientists have opted to take a more history-based approach within political science to be able to find the answers that they were looking for. And there's two especially that I want to highlight along with the textbook authors and myself. And so what I expect you to be reading along with this lecture is Chapter 1. Of your textbook, as well as what would be called Chapter 11, but I guess it's more like the appendix, Conducting Research at Presidential Libraries. But within Chapter 1, the author does what you should be familiar with, the authors, I should say, do what you should be familiar with by now, and that is conduct a literature review of the research within political science that is specific to research on the presidency itself, presidents and the presidency. And there's two authors there that I want to discuss, and those authors are one of whom is alive, one of whom is no longer alive, and I guess I'll talk about the one that's no longer alive first. That's Richard Neustadt, and he wrote a book called Presidential Power back in the 1950s. And the reason it's significant, hopefully, will become clear in just a minute. He was a young Harvard graduate student, as we all are at some point, right? So not your ordinary everyday person, pretty privileged and pretty brilliant. He managed to get himself a job as a special assistant in the Truman White House first, and then in the Eisenhower White House. And his job as a special assistant enabled him to understand the nature of how he saw presidential power being exercised. And he saw Truman and Eisenhower as having two very separate ideas of how power worked, or at least initially they thought that he thought that would be the case. But he saw that there were some consistencies there that he was able to build upon and study each and every president after Truman and Eisenhower, all the way up through Bush, the first George Bush, after Reagan, and then into Bush. So he did a case study first of those two White Houses that was published in, I think the year was 1953. And then for every new president, he came out with a new chapter of how that White House worked and how it was building on his idea of how presidential power worked. Well, how did he think presidential power worked? From his observations, he saw that Harry Truman had a very distinct way of going about making decisions and getting those decisions implemented into action. And I'm reminded also of a Truman quote at the end of his presidency, and to paraphrase it, because I don't have it in front of me, Truman said about Eisenhower that he felt sorry for the incoming president because he thought, he believed that Eisenhower thought that it would just be a simple matter of ordering people to do things and they would do them, and that's not how the White House works, and it's not how Washington works. I believe Truman underestimated Eisenhower, and I think Neustadt felt that as well. But that was because Truman felt that the military operated separately from the White House, and maybe that he didn't realize just how political Eisenhower already was. And in terms of what the nature of that power is, I can give you a couple of examples. Okay. Let's say you're the Secretary of Education. All right. And you're the Secretary of Education, and you come to the president and you say, Mr. President, or Madam President, perhaps in the future, I'm sure in the future, Madam President, I think that we need to cancel or forgive all student loan debt for all students who have ever taken it out, and then implement a drastic new policy where we fund public universities so that no student has to take out any loans, and create a program whereby people do get ample assistance that they need to be able to get need-based aid, not in the form of loans, and kind of ban all banks from doing student-based loans. And so it's the job of the Education Secretary to bring ideas like that to the president, but it's also the job of the Education Secretary to hear the president when the president brings that idea to the Education Secretary, to the cabinet, and the president says, I think we need to do this. I heard a really good report from a journalist, or I read a good book where they said we should cancel student debt. And it's the Education Secretary's job to first ignore and then actually shut down the president's proposals. And why do this? And why is this the job of the Education Secretary? First of all, my example was flawed when I first started talking. I didn't mean to say that the Education Secretary came up with that idea. That was not how it was supposed to go. The president came up with an idea, or the president heard an idea from somewhere, and the president thought, hey, Mr. or Madam Education Secretary, we need to implement this idea, so let's get moving on it. And so let's write a bill, let's have an executive action, let's do something. And the Education Secretary, it's that person's job to say, well, I'll think about it, Mr. President, but if the president brings it up 3 times in a week, 3 times consecutively somehow in 3 different meetings, then Neustadt observed that that's when a secretary really started to actually have an active response to the president that was in the affirmative or the negative, usually in the negative, telling the president why it was a bad idea. Because it was the education secretary's job to be not only the president's subordinate and the president's kind of a person who reports to the president as simply an underling and a functionary who implements the president's policies, but also that is a person that has been confirmed by the Senate, and that confirmation might have been a battle. And that confirmation battle was definitely waged by people on both the kind of liberal and conservative sides, for instance, of the kind of issues surrounding education, and we all know that there are many surrounding higher education and education. And so if you're a Democratic president, you probably are going to be endorsed by major teachers unions around the country, as well as, you know, the larger kind of labor infrastructure, as well as, you know, various kind of women's advocacy groups by people of color and Native Americans, and you know, and as well as kind of many corporate interest groups as well. I mean, they're going to try to get as wide of a spectrum as they can for endorsing just someone who is supposed to be a subordinate and supposed to carry out policies rather than, you know, initiate new ones. And that person has done that, and so they are not only the president's functionary and kind of not CEO, but you might say vice president of that sector of education. And this is the same as if you're talking about defense, commerce, labor, transportation, all those other issues that have cabinet departments, right? And that education secretary has to have the backing and the credibility of those groups, because they are in many ways the ambassador of the president to those groups and the ambassador from those groups to the president. So it's that person's job to say, Mr. President, we might be able to get some of the groups that back me and back you in your election and re-election to go for this, but we can't get all of them. And the ones that we can't get, we really can't get. They're really opposed. You know, banking groups, for example, might be opposed to, you know, canceling student debt. You know, private industry, like, and you know, private higher education, right? Just nonprofit institutions that are not public. You know, they might have a problem with it. So let's not go too far into that one example, but you know, there's going to be a lot of groups that are opposed to things. So the president really needs to keep all those people on his or her side when making, you know, policy decisions that really matter to them, that are kind of central to their agenda. And the president has hired that person to be the voice in the room to tell them why it is that while they personally, as president, might think that it's a good idea, it's that person's job to tell the president no. And let me emphasize that. No. Because we would lose the support of XYZ. Now, in the case of canceling student debt, has the support of many major labor unions, so it wouldn't be that. But it may be, you know, banking interest groups, whatever. So that's why the president might back off, right? The president might say, you're right. Okay, we just can't do it. We would like to. I would like to personally, but I don't want to lose the support of those very, very powerful interest groups that have backed me, and I need them for my re-election. So let's not do it. Or, you know, backing on other legislation. So let's not do it. The president has to be able to persuade people. They have to be able to have credibility to persuade people. And they can't do that by constantly taking controversial stands that would undermine their fundamental kind of broad-based popularity. And if they were only popular to a narrow group of people, the narrower, the worse for them. They're not going to be able to get reelected. So the president tries very much to keep a high approval rating And that approval rating is like a raw score of the popularity of a president, but also the persuasive power of the president to be able to persuade members of Congress to take a risk with him or with her on controversial policy proposals. Because if you're a president with a 60% approval rating, you can bet that if they go to Capitol Hill and say, we need you, I'm popular, come with me, it's a risk, I will protect you, I will help you raise money for re-election, even if your district doesn't like this right now. That person will believe the president based really on the popularity score of whether people think that that president is doing a good job or not. So Neustadt observed that presidential persuasion, not only of persuading Congress, but also of persuading world leaders, ambassadors, interest groups, for example, as I was mentioning before, interest groups, whether they be corporate, citizen-based, labor-based, any sort of interest group, they need to be able to persuade that interest group that I am a credible president. If you come with me and do this thing that you don't necessarily want, you can kind of attach yourself to me, your group's name to me, and I will be able to protect you, and we'll be able to protect each other in a mutually beneficial arrangement, blah, blah, blah. So the president's power to get anything done is the president's ability to persuade in multiple venues across really the human experience that presidents have access to. So persuading voters, persuading Congress, persuading world leaders, persuading the media, and persuading interest groups are all the same thing. That's why you constantly hear the president speaking out and trying to make persuasive speeches. That, sometimes in the age of the internet and media, gets watered down. So, I've spent a lot of time on Neustadt. See why this is, I only have 2 authors up here. So Neustadt is basically saying that the way the presidency works, and he can evaluate how persuasive every president is that it relies on the power of the presidency to persuade. I think it's the first line in the book. The power of the presidency is the power to persuade. That's it. So bargaining, being able to bargain with the leverage of popularity, is a president is only as powerful as how popular he or she is. And that's why you see the media constantly reporting on the approval rating of presidents. So feel free to take a look at the approval rating of presidents, and sometimes that's tied to something as simple as an economic indicator like unemployment or inflation, or just the success of any given war that's going on, the stock market. All those things are kind of factors that seem to play in a lot to whether a president is popular or not. So I'll give you an approval rating kind of history lesson just by showing you what some of the resources are out there for you to see. Another author that you should know is Stephen Skowronek. And in the past, I've used Stephen Skowronek's textbook, The Politics Presidents Make, and the Presidency in Political Time is another one. He has this idea about political time. And this idea is that leadership styles of presidents repeat themselves. And they're very cyclical. Okay, and I'll show you just how cyclical in a second. But the idea is no matter how much the presidency is able to think of it as running around in circles and kind of running a relay race, that relay race unfortunately starts being run in quicksand, because eventually history actually happens. History progresses, and you can't just retread the same ground and be the same kind of leader as the leader 4 cycles ago was. You have to be a new kind of leader, and there's simply not the same archetype available to you. And not only that, but the presidency itself begins to, if you think of baking a cake, and if you stir, all the ingredients, even if you've never done it, just picture it, right? Flour and eggs and I don't know, whatever else. I don't think I've really done it either, but cement, same metaphor. You stir it, you stir it, you stir it till it becomes thicker and harder to move. So eventually, Skowronek's theory is that even though the presidency keeps getting run around in cycles, the history starts getting a lot harder to move. And even though the presidency keeps going and going and going, and the rhetoric keeps happening the same way it did cyclically, that stuff that happens, the ability of the president to impact public policy and the economy and all the things that particular president, and in the style of leadership that he or she has, the ability of that president to do that in the same way that has been done in history is lessened over time. And eventually, he's saying that the window of opportunity, and not the window of opportunity, the ability to affect any change, becomes more and more narrow, difficult, and even unobtainable, perhaps, in the very near future. So, cyclical. So, very easy. And if you know any presidential history, that's why this is not a presidential history class, but I'll just say, you can say it from Prejudential maybe, and certainly from the presidency textbook. Certain kinds of leadership styles. Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. Okay, that's where we'll stop. So Reagan was definitely a fantastic orator, right? Did he actually have the ability to completely rewrite the American Constitution and roll back the American welfare state? Not really. Because FDR's presidency solidified so much of the American experience in kind of things like Social Security, and eventually like Medicare and Medicaid that would really come later, but that were extensions of this, in unemployment insurance and welfare, that the American welfare state grew so much, in addition to the kind of regulation of business that grew so by leaps and bounds during the Roosevelt presidency, that the ability of Reagan to just cancel those programs was non-existent, right? So Skowronek is basically saying that even though once a generation or two, a transformative leader comes on the scene, that transformative leader is only going to be able to transform so much. And that's his central point. But just a smaller point is that transformative leader isn't the only leadership style he identifies. It's not just sort of transformative leaders and then terrible leaders. It is basically broken into 3 other leadership styles. And they are, and you don't have to know this, but I'm telling you, transformative, and then people who are orthodox innovators. This is also called the favorite son presidency. So presidencies that are faithful sons, like James K. Polk, for example, was called Little Andrew Jackson or Young Hickory, right? Let's see, James Monroe and James Madison were just extensions of Thomas Jefferson's legacy. They belonged to the same political party. They were from the same state. They both served 2 terms. They both belonged to the same political party. They were, rich, wealthy, landed aristocrats who owned other people, right? So like this is all of those things. Like they were very much seen as sons of the Revolution that were like Thomas Jefferson. There was disjunctive president. Sorry, there was not disjunctive. I'm forgetting the name, the vocabulary he gives to it, but it's the sort of exception president. This president that, for example, from the time of Lincoln to the time of Roosevelt, so this is the 1860s to the 1930s, guess how many Democratic presidents there were? 2. So this is a very Republican dominated era. And Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson were both kind of opposed to the existing order. And those two presidents really couldn't get much done, but they were seen as kind of alternatives, and they were opposed to the existing order that was being practiced at the time. And so, and the last part is the disjunctive president. So the disjunctive president is the person at the end of an era who is trying to prop up the old regime. And so Herbert Hoover is seen as a disjunctive president by Skowronek. He says that Hoover is like the last Republican of the Republican era who is trying to uphold Lincoln's legacy in a way that's not really even Lincoln-esque, and maybe not even in agreement with all of Lincoln's policies, but he's trying to keep going with the order that was established and had been going for at least the last 8 years before he was elected. So he did this by employing the same Treasury Secretary, for example, as the previous two administrations had employed, Andrew Mellon. And so that's how, in the Great Depression, he ran out of steam, right? He wasn't able to keep going with, he wasn't able to create new policies because there wasn't room in kind of the Republican ideology or coalition to be able to do more with government at all. That really belonged in the camp of the new Democrats that were in power in Roosevelt in the later, when he was defeated for re-election. So Hoover was a good example of a disjunctive president. But when I give you the disjunctive president list, you'll see, I think you'll see instinctively that they belong together in terms of leadership archetypes. John Adams, John Quincy Adams. Let's see, James Buchanan, right before the Civil War. He actually supported states seceding. He had the kind of Jacksonian states' rights ethos. So that was a non-starter for the Civil War. Hoover, of course, and then Jimmy Carter. Right, Jimmy Carter is seen as the last disjunctive president before the kind of modern era. Skowronek is often called upon these days. He's retired at Yale now, and he's called upon. I think he's retired. I actually don't know, but he's been at Yale for a good number of years, and he's often called upon to say, "This president is a disjunctive president. This president is a transformative leader president. This president is an orthodox innovator. This president is whatever other archetype." So the value in that is that many people look to Skowronek as this kind of modern oracle, but they also have taken a framework from him to see like how much a president can actually have an impact on the presidency, and taking the lessons of some of his examples from the past, we can see how much presidents have pushed against the existing order to be able to transform it, or they seem seeking to prop up the old order. So that's really the question. Even though it seems to be a very partisan model, it's not always the case that you can easily characterize a president's presidency by whether or not that person was a Democrat or a Republican. They might have, like Bill Clinton, for example, taken a lot of Republican ideas and kind of extended Democratic Party power by adopting, by choosing to kind of operate within the Republican vocabulary and ethos. So anyway, so those are some of the contributions that have been made through historical research, but I would say first that Neustadt actually made a lot of his observations firsthand. Okay, so in many ways he was sort of a participant observer rather than just an archivist. And Skowronek is somebody who, maybe he's met a president or two. I'm not sure that he has, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had. He's probably met Clinton and Obama, for example. That's my big guess. But he largely has done a lot of this through media research, and I'll explain what that means in just a minute. But the reason I put these other people here, like Lori CoxHan, is that these two researchers I just explained, Skowronek and Neustadt, both just got a bunch of information together through different means, and they looked at it, and they created their own theory about how things worked based on what they read and what they saw. And that's really all research is kind of not only forming a theory, but forming a new understanding of how things work. And Lori CoxHan has done the same thing in her own research on, why, how a women-run White House, for example, would be different, but also just how a communications office within the White House has worked. She got up close and personal with a lot of people in the White House communications office during the Bush administration. She was able to write a book recently, as I think I've mentioned in another video, about Pat Buchanan and how he was the White House communications director during the Reagan administration. He had also worked in the Nixon administration and just how much of an impact on presidential rhetoric he had. And I say, myself, I'll talk about my own research in another video, I think, but the idea is that you can be a researcher just by having a conversation. And I want to just highlight the fact that something was said to me during graduate school by a teacher of mine, whom I can embarrass. I think it's fine. Just look him up. His name's Dean Robinson. And Dean Robinson said to me at one point something that I think every political science student needs to hear when they first walk in the door on day one as a first-year student when they're, 18, 19. And in political science research is a conversation. And in a conversation, you can't rely on something someone said 20 years ago if they've talked about the same things for 20 years and they've further developed their ideas all the way up to the modern day. And a lot of it has changed, evolved, and even contradicted a lot of their earlier sentiments and earlier conclusions. So when you're having a conversation with someone, you can't call back something they said 10 years ago. When you're, say, in a relationship or a conversation with that person, you can't say, you said this many years ago, how come you're saying this today? They're like, have we been talking for 20 years or have we not been talking for 10 or 20 years? So it's a conversation. And so in research, the best thing to do is to find the best researchers out there and find their latest and greatest pronouncements and their latest and best research on whatever question it is that interests you and interests them. And with Skowronek, that's why a lot of journalists, for example, come to talk to him on a regular basis. And that's why we look at Richard Neustadt's, work on Reagan and Bush, because it was the last bit of research he did. But he also republished everything from the earlier stuff. So he kind of had this idea that he could not contradict himself later in life. So he's sort of the exception, but still, we should look at his later work, not just his early work. And, this is different from Paul Buell and Margaret Kimberley, because Paul Buell is an historian, or, spent his career as an historian, is now just a writer of popular history. And Margaret Kimberley is a journalist who has a certain perspective and kind of seeks to unearth this truth that has been neglected, right? And it's more like a reporting on history, right? And just kind of a look at this, and isn't this interesting? But she's also given her interpretation to it, so we should respect that, certainly. Okay, so and hopefully this can be you in developing your own kind of research very soon. So to do research, you need access to resources. So to be able to find out questions that you want to know about how the presidency works, or how one presidency worked versus another presidency, you're going to need access to information. And I'll tell you that there are several types of information resources that are referenced up here. One is, of course, libraries. And libraries can be of many different types. Libraries can be public libraries that maybe you're already familiar with. You walk in, there's a big biography section, and they talk about local authors and things like this and have kids' story time. That's public libraries. Great resource. But they often don't have the budget to subscribe to the kind of databases that academic libraries do. And academic libraries have not only books that are more academically, oriented, but they also have access to databases that they subscribe to on an annual basis that are quite expensive. The most popular one being JSTOR. JSTOR is where peer-reviewed journals are accessed, and peer review means that a panel of 3 anonymous experts have reviewed your submission, and the majority of them have deemed it to be not only acceptable, but also in terms of acceptable and accurate research, but also good enough to be published in their journal. Important enough and good enough to be published in their journal. Journals have a very high rejection rate, so it's considered a very high academic achievement to be able to publish an article in a journal. All right, and so so that's why academic articles are stored on JSTOR, as are books published by academic libraries. And then there's presidential libraries. And presidential libraries tend to keep things like, they didn't exist really until the Hoover presidency, and then the Roosevelt presidency. I've only been to a few. I've been to the Nixon Library, the Roosevelt Library, the Truman Library. I've been to Chester Arthur's grave site in Albany, New York, and Franklin Pierce's birthplace, I think, in New Hampshire. Grover Cleveland has a painting hanging in the New York State Capitol in Albany. Woodrow Wilson had a house in Washington, D.C. that he actually lived in after his presidency. And the two I haven't been to in the vicinity of where I'm from is Grant. It has, well, that's a whole other story about Grant. But he had his post-presidency home was in Saratoga Springs, New York, or Malta, near that. And Calvin Coolidge has a presidential, at least, library in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he was the mayor, and then he was governor of Massachusetts. So so those are kind of all in the Northeast, I guess, or of course, except for Nixon. Oh, and I got to have a picture on one of the Air Force One. Old Air Force Ones that is now at the Air Force Base in Central Valley in Atwater, California. The former Air Force Base in Atwater, California. So those libraries are tourist attractions, but they're also places where presidential papers, like all the letters they ever wrote, are, and all the speeches they ever made, were. That was somewhere you could go, and it is somewhere you can still go and find those original papers or copies of them if that's all you need. And they have regular kind of rotations of historians, political scientists, and journalists who are always going after, writing new books about different various presidents. And so their research rooms are often, pretty restricted, but also I've had friends, I haven't done it myself, but a lot of people like to go to those and find newspaper clippings and all kinds of great archival resources. Now, the University of California at Santa Barbara has created this treasure trove of documents of like every public papers of the president that you can imagine is on their online database called the Presidency Project. And so everything that I could think of certainly is there. So you don't need to travel to any of these presidential libraries. You can just go to UCSB. And I'll give you the link to this, but it's an amazing, amazing resource. And I don't think they have video, but you can find, for example, if you want to look at commercials for presidential campaigns, you can go to the Living Room Candidate. It's a place where you can put on by the New York's Museum of the Moving Image, and it's access to every major party presidential candidates' campaign ads on TV since 1952. So Nixon, Eisenhower, Johnson, George Wallace, George Bush, and all these others, and Kennedy and everybody. It's pretty great. You can find all that stuff there. But so I don't think there's a lot of video if any, on the Presidency project, but you can find information there. But those are just raw material, right? That's just access to raw material, and you can contrast public presidential language. You don't have access to really private presidential language and correspondences, but everything that was, public record or is public record is something that you can find at the Presidency project. And so archives are really what are at those libraries. And so you can do in-person research of that kind. If you're like Richard Neustadt and you can get hired by the White House, you can do in-person modern research, or you can interview people who were in past administrations. You could interview Obama's chiefs of staff, for example, or you could interview people who worked in the Clinton White House or the Reagan White House still. But farther back than that, it's harder to find people. Carter, Ford, Nixon, I guess, but I think beyond that, you're maybe the Kennedy White House is as far back as it can go. You'd be really lucky if you found someone who worked in the Eisenhower administration. So as time goes on, it gets obviously harder to find people like that. So you're not going to be able to find anybody who worked in the Lincoln White House or the Jefferson White House or the Jackson White House. So you have to rely on archives, all right? But if you have the opportunity, as I'll explain in another video, sometimes interviewing people or immersing yourself in the politics that's going on at that point really might be a lot richer of an experience than just kind of going back and looking up statistics and not only statistics but even documents. So let's see. So your research proposal. Before I talk about yours, I'll say that I did write a book, and so I have some experience in this. So I want to give you the benefit of that. I was able to put together a book proposal. And I don't want yours to look like mine. Let me say that first. So I really don't, even though you're going to ask me that again. I don't want yours to look like mine. But a research proposal is just an idea given flesh, but it's also it's an idea that you are hoping to persuade a publisher is worthwhile in publishing a book, but also that it has academic heft and that it's going to have information and that's going to be from one of those types of sources. And then the design is something I'll talk about in another video, but basically there are three approaches, qualitative, quantitative, or interpretive. And interpretive is one that I'm certainly more familiar with, but I'm certainly just as literate to be able to talk to you about quantitative and qualitative types of research and what the goals behind those are and how you might go about them. So you're free to choose any one of those three. But I guess I've gone on for long enough here, and I just want you to keep in mind that these resources are only just here for you to be able to make a contribution like Neustadt, like Skowronek, and like Lori CoxHan, and be able to take the information that's in front of you and give a new perspective on it, not reiterate what a past perspective was, and not to reiterate, what is against the conventional wisdom. It's your responsibility as a researcher to find out what the kind of main arguments are out there and main understandings are of in a scholarly way of whatever topic it is that you've decided to delve into. And if you can offer something to the conversation, then something substantive that people should hear and that's accurate and trustworthy, then that should make sense to you. I hope it does, of why you should even do this research in the first place and why people should listen to what you have to say. Otherwise, you're just sort of doing a book report, or you're kind of regurgitating what's been done by someone who has done a lot of hard work. So if you want to do some of that hard work or propose how it would be done, I'm not expecting you to do any of this research because I don't think that that's a realistic expectation, either in any semester. Okay, in any one semester. I think once you understand, I think I might be wrong about this, but most political science students in undergraduate context don't have a good grasp yet of what research is. And so for you to both get it, have an idea for it, write the idea, do it, collect the data and write it up all in one semester, not enough time. So I want you to develop just a sketch of what kind of research proposal would be interesting and what some of the existing literature is about there on it, in addition to what you've already found in your textbook. Okay, and I'll give you a little bit more instruction on that in another video. Thanks for watching.